the prospect of total mobilization. The 9th of May, the Victory Day, is a crucial symbolic date. We should expect the victory parade and Putin's speech to the nation on that day. What is he gonna say? Many are pondering whether he will 1. Declare war on Ukraine, 2. Declare mass mobilization in Russia. Let's discuss both. Thread. Let's start with the question, why Putin didn't declare the war on Ukraine yet? Well, probably because he didn't expect any serious resistance. Kremlin planned for another Czechoslovakia in 1968 and was very much surprised it didn't happen. Hence the special operation terminology, planning for another pacification of an East European satellite state. Moscow unexpectedly got into a major war it didn't prepare for. Since they didn't prepare for a war, they declared neither a war nor a martial law, which had major consequences for the course of this war. Russian state policies may not be legal, but they absolutely are procedural. It is a machine acting according to an algorithm. More specifically, the war and the martial law are largely regulated by the algorithm described in the 30th of January 2002 1, which has not been activated. As the martial law algorithm was not activated, procedurally speaking, Russia is now in peace. Thus all the peacetime procedures are still valid. In practical terms, it means that the army, the National Guard and other contractors can just leave their job. See Strelkov's lament.
Я имею информацию о том, что во многих частях и подразделениях российских войск, узнав, что их отправляют воевать на Украину, очень многие контрактники сказали: не, я разрываю контракт. Ну вот, я там санкции, я там потеряю, меня штрафуют, там прочее. Все, плевать, я на это хотел. Я готов был служить пока. Вот.
В мирной армии? Да,
в мирной армии, то есть меня все устраивало, а вот теперь нет. И что вы мне сделаете?
Ну, уволят из армии.
Уволят из армии, правильно.
Он, собственно, это и квартиру или что-нибудь там, что у него? Что
ну, если у него есть квартира, там, да. Что если у него есть служебное жилье, а может у него и нету ничего. Но факт заключается в том, что фактически человек дезертирует. Фактически человек совершает преступление военное, воинское преступление. А его за это никто не может наказать. Почему? Войны нет, значит законы военного времени не работают.
Да, у нас юридически войны нет.
Ну, раз войны нет, то кто его может удержать в армии, если он не хочет?
Many either leave their jobs or refuse to go to war. According to Russian media, dozens or hundreds of Krasnodar Oman, Crimean Marines, Pskov Airborne, soldiers from South Ossetia, Kharkov National Guards refuse to fight. Watch a dialogue of a National Guard boss with his fighters.
11 хакасов сейчас уволили. Помните, в Смоленске еще 11 хакасов отказалось? Все уже уволены. Созданы такие условия, что ни один из них не может устроиться. Ну, я вам говорю, на нормальную работу в государственной структуре. Ну, а как по-другому? Люди, когда надо было постоять за страну, они почему-то струсили. Как может собровец, мужик, который профессионал, покинуть поле боя? Как вы собираетесь жить потом? Ведь жизнь пройдет 2-3 недели, и вся эта бодяга закончится. А как дальше-то будете жить? То, что мы раньше с вами к этому не привлекались, ну да, не было такой войны. Еще раз говорю, я имею право с вами разговаривать без всяких там политических там подоплек там и так далее. Я с вами разговариваю в открытую, по-офицерски, по-мужски. Я вообще не считаю, что офицер имеет право покидать поле боя. Вы фактически стали на путь преступления и предательства. Что страшнее, не знаю. Вот жизнь, она не заканчивается, блядь, вот в этой каменке сраной. Она будет продолжаться, только вы, блядь, для себя жизнь свою разделите, блядь, до предательства и после предательства. Я вам даю 3 дня. 3 дня, чтобы вы своей башку, блядь, подумали, что вы тут сейчас натворили. Через 3 дня мы с вами повторно собираемся. Если вы пишете рапорта на дембель, значит пишите рапорта на дембель, пинок отсюда. И, блядь, больше, чтобы, я еще раз говорю, я напишу телеграмму за трусость и малодушие. За трусость и малодушие. В вашем личном деле.
In other words, desertion from the Russian military is now legal as long as you are a paid contractor. Of course, Army and National Guard bosses try to prevent that. Some issue executive orders forbidding the military to quit their jobs until their special goals are completed. Some commanders try to destroy the record of the military who quit, putting a special notes or stamps into their military IDs, personnel files, etc. That, however, has little effect on your future unless you plan to work for the state. Besides, you can sue them. Those troops who already departed to war and were later returned, refused to go again. For example, after the VDV were massacred in Ukraine, around 100 airborne from Pskov who were returned home from Belarus, refused to go to the war again. In practical terms, that means that the ability of Russia to regroup, withdrawing its forces from the north, Kiev, in order to send everyone to the east, Donbas, was probably exaggerated. Many of those who already been to Ukraine and were returned to Russia simply won't go again. Situation with conscripts is a bit different. Technically, sending conscripts to Ukraine is illegal, and yet, they did it, of course. Russian state basically admitted it, and Putin ordered the military prosecutors to investigate the case. My prediction: no army boss will be punished. Putin using conscripts in a foreign war was very predictable. Since at least the new year, the Soldiers' Mothers NGO was getting tons of calls from concerned parents whose conscripted sons were transferred to the Ukrainian border. There were so many of them, it couldn't be a drill. Go and take them from there, a secretary of the Soldiers' Mothers would tell, or just tell them to run away, hide somewhere and write complaints to the military prosecutors. But not a single daughter of a bitch, not a single son of a bitch didn't go anywhere, concludes she.
Ну, потому что столько войск на границе, перекинутых со всей страны, это не могло быть никакими учениями, никакой угрозы. Это было понятно, что туда скидывают народ для того, чтобы воевать. Слишком много, слишком большая линия. Если бы они хотели только в Донбасс, все бы ограничивалось исключительно Ростовской областью, как это было в 14-15 и дальше. Да? А поскольку все это вытянулось вот в эту линию, было понятно, что войска войдут. Да? Или, во всяком случае, будет большая угроза. И чем ближе было, как бы, вот Новый год прошел, а туда все везут, январь кончается, а туда все везут, и стали мне звонить родители. Он говорит: Метно, у меня тут с декабря. Вот сын сказал, вот их везут на границу с Украиной, что делать? Я говорю: поезжайте, забирайте. Ну, что я могу сказать? Как мы в 95-м году говорили, так мы и сейчас говорим. Ой, ну как же я поеду? Я говорю: ну хорошо, тогда ты позвони, скажи, чтобы они бежали из части в какое-нибудь, кому-нибудь, да, безопасное место. Я пришлю им какой рапорт в военную прокуратуру, и тишина. Ой, а его трибунал расстреляет. Я на третий разозлилась. Я говорю: ты, девка, ты молодая, откуда ты слово такое знаешь, трибунал? Ну, ни одна сукина дочь и ни один сукин сын. Никто никуда не поехали. Это тоже как было в 95-м году. Никто, солдаты и даже офицеры не понимали до 1 января 95-го года, куда их собирают.
In other words, parents of conscripted soldiers could totally use the procedural nature of the Russian state to prevent their sons from being sent to Ukraine. Nobody did. Why? Partly because of the lack of agency. Russian state extirpated any forms of agency for centuries. Uprooted sense of agency and personal responsibility is an elephant in the room. After this war, Russians will need a rehabilitation course to regain them again. But such a rehabilitation is incompatible with the existence of the Russian state which uprooted them in the first place. Dismantling of the Russian state is necessary not only for preventing further attempts of imperial restoration and thus large military conflicts, but as a necessary condition for a rehabilitation which would restore the sense of agency and personal responsibility. Majority of the Russian population believe they can't do anything. Their personal actions have no impact and the best they can do is submit, which is not wrong. In such massive empire their voice has no weight and no impact. Thus the empire must be dismantled to smaller polities. Tsars, communists, Putin, all worked hard to uproot the personal agency in Russia. Navalny and company will work even harder, should they take power. Dismantling the empire will scale the politics down, which is a prerequisite for people regaining the feeling that their actions matter. Interpreting Russian politics in terms of Putin versus Russian people dichotomy is an awful approach. Why? Because Putin is a subject while the Russian people are not. They are merely an abstraction that allows an autocrat and a gang of courtiers to legitimize their rule. Russian people doesn't exist as a subject, it's a tool for the legitimization of an autocracy. Right now Putin legitimized his power by pretending to represent the Russian people with no agency. Should the regime change happen, Navalny and his courtiers will do the same. Why should any autocrat and his gang of courtiers in Moscow have the right to represent the Russian people and do whatever by their name? Let them represent themselves, and the entire political structure should be scaled down exactly so they could represent themselves. What I don't like about the Western media is that they have a very weird bias when representing the Russian voices. They almost exclusively give word to such figures as Navalny, Khodorkovsky, Kashin, etc. To the liberal equals nationalist establishment of Moscow. The problem with Navalny, Khodorkovsky, Kashin etc. is not only that they are all ethnic Russians in an increasingly diverse country. The problem is not only that every single of them publicly proclaimed himself as a Russian nationalist. The problem is that they are all from Moscow. The fact that the Western media and the cultural establishment almost exclusively gives the word to the liberal equals nationalist establishment of Moscow means that they are effectively deplatforming all other voices and reinforcing the idea that only the Moscow should have a voice. This policy of exclusively giving the word to the Moscow establishment makes sense only if Moscow is truly the only subject in this country and all others are a cattle to be guided and disciplined, who have no opinion of their own, and if they do, it doesn't matter anyway. My point is, let's question this assumption. Let's assume that people all around the country have voices which matter, and if we don't hear them, it's largely because they are being systematically ignored or deplatformed by both Russian and Western media and cultural establishment. Instead of taking a 100th interview from a liberal politician from Moscow, whose liberalism consists in aspiring to become yet another Tsar or a courtier, why don't you interview people from Khabarovsk or Yekaterinburg? Have you even tried to ask what they think? Like recently a German journalist told me that we don't see any evidence of wide discontent in Russia. The question is, who are we here? Apparently those who invested a lot of time and effort in not noticing any form of region's identity, agency or action. This determination to ignore the regional agency is reflected in the fact that when discussing the possible collapse and dismantling of Russia, Western analysts almost exclusively focus on ethnic minorities and ethnic republics. They completely ignore the non-ethnic regionalism. Apart from defeating Putin and establishing a weak peace to be broken by the next Tsar, we must work on re-enfranchising the Russian population. The first thing to do is to give voice to the unheard, especially from the regionalist movements, in the Far East, in Siberia, in Urals. I'll go into details in further threads on why I stand against the Moscow liberals and on the national divorce scenario of the Russian future. For now I'll just express my surprise in how much effort do the media invest in ignoring and deplatforming non-Moscow voices from Russia. Now let's return to the prospects of a total or partial mobilization which may be declared on the 9th of May. The problem with the total mobilization is that Russia has no capacity to do it properly. The USSR could, while Russia absolutely can't. Soviet military doctrine was designed for the total mobilization. In practical terms it meant that the army and the military infrastructure was ready for the quick and enormous expansion of its ranks and the huge inflow of untrained or poorly trained conscripts. Soviet army had way more officers in its divisions than it needed to lead the peacetime number of soldiers. Why? Because after the mobilization the ranks of the army, and of its divisions, would expand quickly, and now it would need those extra officers to command new recruits. Furthermore, the Soviet army maintained a costly infrastructure of training facilities, to train soldiers, and of military schools, to train officers. As the cadre officers would suffer heavy casualties, the USSR had to train new officers from civilians in those schools. Anecdotally, one Soviet artillery officer recalled how he was recruited. During the World War II, a group of newly mobilized recruits were told to sit down and write, sinus. Those who wrote sin were sent to the officer schools, while those who couldn't, to foot soldier ranks. Soviet Union maintained a massive infrastructure in case of the World War and mass mobilization, and yet, it was super costly and made little sense in the absence of such a war. Much of it declined in the 1990s and whatever remained was dismantled during the Serdyukov's reforms. Minister Serdyukov launched a sensible reform to create a professional, contractor, army always ready for a conflict. In practice, however, it meant that the military doctrine changed and the new one didn't include an option of a mass mobilization at all. Facilities to train the gargantuan number of soldiers and officers from recruits are closed. Extra officers in existing divisions who would lead those recruits into battle were fired. Many of cadre officers Russia still has are now in Ukraine and many are already KIA. To sum up, Russia has the capacity to draft the enormous number of recruits via a mass mobilization. It has no capacity to train them, provide them with required equipment or with officers' leadership, which means that a mass mobilization would be a really dumb decision. Declaring a mass mobilization would be dumb, and yet, that does not mean that Putin wouldn't do it. He can, as a general rule. Prognosing a leader's decisions based on common sense or on logic is largely counterproductive. A leader absolutely can do something dumb. As Gigsierdany taught us, in a business of state, we must focus not on what we think a prince should do, but on what he'll probably do judging from his nature and his habits. Judging from the Putin's nature and habits, I would estimate a probability of him declaring a mass mobilization on the 9th of May at 20%. He can raise the stakes largely for the PR effect and for boosting his legitimacy. It, however, will probably be a grave mistake. Consider the following. If a mass mobilization is really declared, Russian military bases and existing training facilities would be overflown with a mass of poorly motivated recruits under unmotivated and incompetent leadership. More motivated and competent leaders are in Ukraine. You can't just send a recruit into a frontline assault. You need to at least give him some equipment, provide a basic training on how to use it, place him under someone's command and then ship them all to Ukraine. Meanwhile, you need to quarter and feed them somewhere. Putin absolutely can declare the mass mobilization, but it will be conducted in a situation of almost no infrastructure and almost no organizational capacities for such a mobilization and within a military doctrine that effectively excludes a possibility of such a mobilization. In case of total mobilization, we'll have barracks and training facilities overcrowded by the enormous number of poorly motivated recruits under a weak leadership. And these recruits know they'll be sent to Ukraine where they are likely to be KIA. That's a revolutionary situation. As a general rule, we tend to hugely exaggerate the role of unarmed civilians and underrate the role of people with guns in any civil conflict. That's partially wishful thinking and partially an ideology which deliberately focuses on non-violent protests and ignores anything else. Right now I estimate the probability of a successful mass revolt in Russia as close to zero. In case of the mass mobilization, however, it's gonna skyrocket. You'll have tons of armed people with an immediate self-interest in overthrowing the regime. That's the scenario of 1917. The major, and underrated of course factor of the 1917 revolution in Russia, or rather a chain of successful coups, were the people with guns. More specifically, the garrison of St. Petersburg, Petrograd, and the Baltic Navy based in Kronstadt, which is very close to the capital. The people would have no chance to overthrow the Tsar unless the Tsar, 1. mobilized them, 2. brought to the capital, 3. trained and gave them guns, 4. made sure they have an immediate self-interest in his overthrow, because otherwise they would be sent to World War I and massacred there. 1917 scenario was predictable. By November 1916, Nicholas too possibly have suspected his Minister of Interior Protapopov of scheming against him and was already looking for other candidatures. He offered this cabinet position to Krysanovsky. Krysanovsky sent his conditions. 1. Return the Guard cavalry, equals the richest and most privileged nobility regiments, to the capital. 2. Transfer a part of gargantuan 460,000 conscripts composed garrison on the capital to police, equals hey, we won't send you to war. 3. Get the rest of the garrison out of the capital. That was a very realistic plan that aimed to reduce the revolutionary risks. Tsar rejected it and Krysanovsky refused to become a Minister of Interior. Less than 3 months later, the Tsar was overthrown, largely by the same garrison of the capital, and the empire fell. I will argue that as a general rule scholars and analysts exaggerate the importance of ideologies. They are armed lettres and largely presume that everyone else is just obsessed with lettres in some highbrow logical constructs as they are, but that's not the case. What scholars and analysts tend to underrate is the position of some conscripted uneducated bumpkins from province that just happen to be armed and quartered in capital in numbers of 460,000. But these bumpkins are way more important as a revolutionary factor than intellectuals. Those conscripted bumpkins may have little interest in complex logical constructs, but they absolutely do have agency and self-interest. Also they have guns. Also there is almost 500,000 of them. Ergo, their position means everything and that of intellectuals, nothing. Consider the following. When Lenin returned to Russia in April 1917, he called for stopping the war immediately. The Bolshevik Party was shocked by such a madness. His own party comrades, other Bolshevik leaders criticized or condemned him, or were in disbelief. Why was the Bolshevik leadership shocked by the suggestion to overthrow the provisional government and stop the war? Largely because nearly all of the educated classes, of the highbrow people, were in favor of continuing the war. What an idiot would stop on the brink of victory? Why Lenin's call for stopping the war immediately wasn't supported by other Bolsheviks? Why were they shocked? Since nearly all the high-status people stood for the war till the victory, the idea to stop it would immediately be associated with the low status. Most Bolshevik leaders were normal people in a sense that their actions and decisions were overwhelmingly motivated by the considerations of status. You do and say what will raise your status in your reference group and avoid whatever you gonna be ostracized for. This is the way. What they didn't understand, however, is that Lenin wasn't normal. Status and social acceptance meant everything to them and nothing to him. Now and many more times he would take wildly unpopular, among even the Bolsheviks, decisions and enforce them, crushing any protest. Unlike most Bolshevik leaders, Lenin had very accurate understanding of reality, and the reality of 1917 was 500,000 of very simple armed people concentrated in the capital with an immediate self-interest to stop the war, equals avoid the trenches, at any cost. Since these uneducated but armed bumpkins were the main military force in the imperial capital, their position was the only one that mattered, while the position of politicians and intellectuals was merely a white noise which Lenin absolutely could, and should, ignore. End of thread.